understood, and we're not fixating on the transaction. So we're going to be exploring all of this sort of stuff. We may go down a few rabbit holes because Karl and I both like doing that. So bear with us. It's going to be a very powerful episode. So without any further ado, Karl Schmidt, welcome.
Thank you so much for the kind, I would say overly generous introduction. And in fact, I understand that the tone of this will always be a little bit back and forth and us taking different views.
Let's start off with a little bit of your history. That'd be wonderful.
Sure. Much of my early career was in strategy consulting. Spent a lot of time also with largely financial services, big banks, doing IT stuff. Web 1.0, to date myself, I did a classic .com startup during that era. But from there, ultimately, I got involved with a company called CEB because I always loved the consulting we did, but it was always kind of the in and out. BCG would be the 6 or 8 week engagement around some bespoke problem for an individual CXO. And the CEB model was so attractive to me because it was essentially to take some of those same processes, but expand it across a longer time horizon to really get after the biggest problems, not just this CMO is facing, but all CMOs are struggling with, and have a much bigger set of resources and team to get after that type of question over 6 or 8 months rather than 6 to 8 weeks. And so from that transition from sort of individual or consulting at the classic BCGs and Deloitte's to doing this type of research where we were solving the same types of problems, but at scale, was a really great transition. And that's where the Challenger work originally came from. And then, of course, what we're largely going to be talking about today.
Well, let's look at the evolution. So obviously Challenger had a huge impact on the sales profession. The jolt effect came along, and now you go on to frame making. And I'm really curious why frame making came about, given the popularity of a methodology like Challenger. What's changed to justify it?
Yeah, so a couple things, and the primary thing that's changed is, and again, I don't know how deep you want me to get into research methodology because I could really spend a lot of time in that rabbit hole, but both of those studies at their core were about sellers. They're about the activity sellers were taking and identifying what was most successful in terms of the behaviors and activities they were involved with. What we did, and this again, I led a chunk of the research that ended up in the Challenger customer work, which ended up kind of expanding the scope to what's happening on the buyer side. And that's really what Framemaking is based on as well, is what's changed for buyers, especially in the last, over a decade since Challenger originally came out. And that's where we're now in a world not only with, overwhelming amounts of content and information beyond, what might be happening organically, but so much has been pushed through marketing automation, as well as now with the emergence of AI, that customers are just at the core. It's such a struggle for them to navigate their own organizations to make these increasingly complex decisions with ever expanding buying groups. And so what's changed since when we first wrote that book, back in 2011 is when it was initially published, that has just emerged or evolved so rapidly from a buyer's perspective, where even when that book came out, no one had yet published data on how many people were involved in the average buying group at that time. And I remember when we first started studying that, this was over a decade ago now, I asked a couple of my researchers to go deep on, well, how many people are in the average buying group for these complex purchases today? And we, again, very, very highly skilled, and 2 of them went after it for longer than I ever could have guessed. And they're like, Karl, just no one's ever published this data. So of course, our next survey, we went after it. And that first set of data came back with 5.4. Now I have to admit, I had a heavy hand in writing that question and honestly wrote it very poorly. But as we then retested that over the years, that number only has gone up and up and up, more than doubling to the most recent data we published. And it's those interpersonal dynamics, that consensus component, that is so different now from the days where we just went after the person in that corner office, that single decision maker who had the economic power to close the deal. Those days are just so different now than they were when the Challenger research was originally initiated.
A client I coached landed the biggest deal ClickUp's ever done, and he had 42 people involved in the buying process. So if you're listening to this, understand that if you are only dealing with 1, 2, or even 3 people, the odds of your sale actually happening are next to 0. And even if it does land, it's likely to churn exceptionally quickly. And there's probably going to be a high degree of resistance because you haven't taken into account what we're going to be discussing in a minute. So pay really close attention to the fact that you have buying committees. They are all on a buyer's journey, but each of them may be at a different stage in the buying journey. And your job is cat herding. It's more project management than it is selling, and it requires a massive amount of research and patience and relationship building. And that's why the Framemaking book is so apposite and timely, because money is not free anymore. the investors are no longer so fixated on growth at any cost.
Yeah.
And they are investors are particularly interested in net recurring revenue and gross recurring revenue. If you aren't keeping your customers, you're toast, and your career is too. So is that a fair statement?
I would absolutely concur. I have to admit, I wish I ever lived in that era when money was free, because I feel like I missed that somehow in my career. But yeah, 100%. The challenge we have today of, again, a couple dynamics. One is just that objective misalignment challenge. And of the things, especially when we talk to commercial leaders, full chief revenue officers, the thing that they are so focused on is how to help their teams be more effective at having that higher level conversation, right? Not just whoever that primary user is or that main point of contact, but how to elevate it to their boss or their boss's boss. But then also those folks over in finance or legal, or again, all the other folks that you have to get a deal through of any significant dollar value and complexity. It's such a challenge for customers to navigate that without our help.
Okay, well, let's get the knife in early in that case. What do leaders need to do about compensation and metrics if they ever want to make a difference in terms of helping their team?
Yeah, so the compensation has always been the third rail of every study we've ever done, right? And if I've learned anything over the years, that weighing in on the subject of comp plans and territories is a space that it's much like religion and politics. You go there only at your own risk. So so that's a space that I cannot point to a lot of specific research that we've done on those topics. So I'm happy to opine, but it's not gonna. I want to make sure that anything I share that's more my opinion rather than something that we have a pretty fundamental research base to weigh in on. So that piece. Now on metrics, there we have looked at it much more detailed, but those elements of validating and evaluating different alternatives for comp plans, I need to be cautious because those are spaces that I don't have as strong a foundation to talk from.
I'm going to keep you here anyway.
Sure. Yeah.
The challenge that we've got is if people are measured and compensated in ways that drive specific behaviors that are counter
Absolutely.
to the customer's best interest, then what you're going to find, without any real surprise, is that salespeople will behave in a way that causes the
Absolutely.
buyer's brain to feel a threat
Yep.
because they're not taking into account the fact that actually most sales die on the vine because of fear.
Yeah.
They fear the functional failure, they fear the social failure, and they
Yep.
fear the emotional, personal failure. And
Yep.
if you don't tackle all three of those and neutralize them, then you're going to end up in no decision. So you end up with a no funeral death
Yep.
because they just die quietly and you become more of an exorcist than a salesperson.
Yeah, and that's the circling back to the metrics part of your question, right? That evaluation measure of those deals lost to no decision is again an area where we see so much opportunity for improvement, because to really understand what was the nature of a deal, and again, some deals are just there isn't a fit match, right? Totally appreciate, or for whatever reason, a given customer may not be ready yet for the solution that you're offering. So again, if the best decision for them is not for your solution to be the answer to their problem, that's the thing that both us as sellers and customers should have an alignment on getting figured out as early in the process as possible to not be wasting everyone's time, right? And so to have better metrics on that up front as a disqualifying element, absolutely critical. But on this aspect of, but what have happened to these deals where it feels like we've got that fit, right? Where it seems like everything's lining up and the deal still dies. That's the piece that we're not seeing sufficient attention to that version of, we'll call it win-loss, no decision analysis. That no decision end of it so often just doesn't get the attention it deserves. And without that, to get to the three levers you were pointing to, especially that element of being judged by our peers and the risk we take as an individual professional to advocate and to put our neck out to say, yeah, no, we should go do this thing. The personal and professional risk that person takes if this deal goes bad is meaningful for not just their success in that company, but for their family, for their professional career advancement. So if we're not thinking about that and helping the customer, have the confidence to proceed in spite of those risks or to overcome them, then honestly, at some level, it's surprising that as many deals get done as they do.
Well, but judging from the metrics that I'm hearing, only about 30% of salespeople hit quota last year,
Yep.
which is a damning indictment, I think, of leadership and the profession generally.
Yep.
I'm not pointing fingers, other than at the cultural pressures that cause sellers to feel the need to put buyers under pressure to make a decision when they don't feel safe. And I think decision safety is one of the most important things that we can discuss. So let's explore that. What causes buyers to feel unsafe and therefore unready to make a decision? So they then say, oh, this sounds great, I'll have to run it up the flagpole, and then you never hear from them again.
Yeah, where you're describing safety, what we talk a lot about in the book is this idea of decision confidence, right? This aspect of, do they feel confident that they're making the best decision they can on behalf of their company around this complex problem that's worth getting after? And that question of confidence, again, we took a pretty deep dive into this, largely because when we looked at the data of the single biggest drivers of a high quality, those more ambitious deals where customer just didn't settle for the lowest price or status quo, the ones that we really went after, the thing that, again, we would all love to sell, those high quality and then low regret deals, the single biggest driver by far of all the attributes we tested, and literally hundreds, including all the old Challenger, all the classic trust, everything you could imagine we threw into these studies over the years. But the single thing that dwarfed everything else was this decision confidence dynamic. Is the buyer have the confidence in their own decision, not confidence in your solution as the supplier or your ability to deliver? It's all supplier agnostic. It's focused on, are we going to be able to make the best decision and then realize the value from it? And using that as the lens for all of what we're trying to do in sales right now is what we advocate for in the book. Because at the core, if we run all of our decisions, all of our strategies on the sales side, to how we enable the decision confidence of our customers, that's going to get the biggest bang on our investment.
And I think we're certainly in agreement here, but the audience, I think, needs to understand that the job of the seller is buyer facilitation rather than sales improvement. And if you're not tackling things like legitimacy, do I have the authority or mandate even to touch this?
Yeah.
Who carries the consequences if this goes wrong? Can
Yeah.
I evaluate this without breaking my brain or my day job? Emotional safety. Can I engage without being embarrassed, blamed, or exposed? These are the kind of questions that we as sellers have to pay attention to, and even ask the buyer to make sure that they understand that we understand the reality of their situation. Because the internal sale, I mean, every salesperson knows the internal sale is harder than the external sale quite often.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I mean, having had the bit of a diverse career that I described up front, back when I was, sitting in the 40th floor corner office at one of the biggest banks in the world, running a big chunk of an IT organization, I was in that seat so often where, these decisions ultimately were going to affect the potential progression of my career. And my boss at the time was the CIO for the Americas. And again, these are the things that if you think about what matters to someone at my level or his level as the buyer of so many of these complex decisions or these complex solutions, that one of the most influential pieces of research we ever did was to ask those buyers what's most important to them as they think about the finalization of the deal. And it was, again, the thing that popped above everything else was the widespread support of my team, right? Of my direct reports, right? And again, you think about it logically, of course that makes sense, right? Because that team are the ones who both are going to be the ones that are going to be tasked with actually making this thing successful and realizing the value of whatever it is we just bought. But also, those are the people in the succession planning for my job if I get hit by a bus or someone sticks a knife in my back, right? So it's not surprising at multiple levels from this sort of emotional confidence, sort of psychological comfort perspective, that of course that's critical to all of this. And unfortunately, for so many years, we kind of walked past that. But that's where in the current environment, we just can't. We have to be an active participant in making that better for our buyers, or we're going to see this ongoing, erosion of deals lost.
Well, the neuroscience on this is really definitive as well. Any form of risk causes
Yeah.
the brain to automatically default to the worst case scenario.
Yep.
So it's not about risk mitigation, it's about risk elimination. And
Yeah.
if we do not eliminate risk, political risk, social risk, financial risk, then the odds are very high that what we're doing is we're creating anticipatory buyer's remorse. So they're actually imagining having bought. And then
Yep.
it backfires, and then they either get a knife in their back, or they lose their job, or they lose political capital and reputation damage. And that then becomes a memory, even though it's not happened. So
Yeah.
we've really got to be very, very careful, especially in an environment where things are getting a bit tougher and tighter. Yeah, the S&P 500 may have had a peak this week, but the reality is 6 of the companies on the S&P 500 account for most of that growth, and
Right.
mostly due to buybacks.
Yeah.
So most of the tech companies are struggling out there, and many other types of businesses are. Oil maybe not, and health maybe not. But the reality is the majority of businesses are finding it pretty tough. So unless we can eliminate risk, then I think what we do is we put our buyers in a position where rather than saying no, they give us a slow death maybe. And
Yeah.
that again means that we end up spending far too much of our time pursuing dead opportunities that cannot buy, will not buy, or shouldn't buy. So, what is it that the frame making sale does in order to mitigate against all of that and eliminate that kind of pushback?
Yeah, you touched on so many points. I trying to pick one to start with because I think this conversation is going to be rich in a bunch of different directions. But the one I would start with is the picture you're painting of how hard it is to buy. Again, you can either look at that as the, oh my goodness, this is, how can I possibly succeed in this world? But from our research and the perspective we take in frame making is that this actually is an enormous opportunity for the sales, for again the broader profession, right? And for why sales should continue to have a critical role, even with so much changing, even with the emergence of AI and everything else, because at the core of what that customer is looking for, again, in terms of risk avoidance, not just mitigation, it is to figure out, well, where are the potholes, right? Where am I going to get tripped up? What have other people like me struggled with when they've tried to make this decision? And this is where the huge advantage we have as a commercial organization more broadly is this core. If you think about asynchronous information access, right, or asymmetries of information, we on the sales side have the advantage, and maybe not individual seller, but certainly as a commercial team, the advantage of working with many people trying to go through this exact same decision, right? So many different buyers who are struggling with it, and we are so quick and prone to go to here's the thing, here's the company that bought this, everything was perfect, right? We're suggesting you're gonna get 100x return, they got 1,000, right? It's always that sort of best possible scenario, which our buyers just don't want to hear. They don't care, right? What they want to know is who got fired because it all went sideways, right? And that's what we are so historically averse to talking about. But that's a huge part of this opportunity, because if we can go to that same customer that has those maybe unspoken concerns, say, you know what, working with customers like you, we've seen a couple things go wrong. And so the things we want to make sure you're absolutely checking up front that you have in place to make this successful are A, B, and C. And you may have already be aware of A and B, but C is the one we've heard from customers that if they were going to do it over, this is the thing that they would do differently or make sure they had ready up front. And that's one that was kind of surprising when we first heard it, and have been surprising we've shared it with others. Would you like to hear about that? And when you set up that kind of conversation with a customer, when we're truly are embracing what we call the frame making mindset of helping them make the best decision they can and sharing up front kind of that dirty laundry, not only does it open up a different style of conversation, but puts you on the same side of the fence as them as, hey, we're here to help make us both successful. And if you're not successful, then I can't possibly win either, right? And so that aspect of turning what is a kind of dark and dire story into a real opportunity for us in the commercial world is the heart and soul of everything we write about in frame making.
And that seems to be a major step forward away from pain discovery and away from the challenger hypothesis, and actually coming as their ally instead of their adversary or their accomplice.
Yeah, I'm actually about to do a series of sessions as part of a sales kickoff related to some of the take control aspect of Challenger, the classic 3 T's of teach, tailor, take control. And the take control is the aspect that again, I would say many people interpret that language not exactly as how the research might have originally portrayed it. But there are, I like to use the analogy of a coach, right? And I coached my daughter's soccer teams for years. And again, we're not the ones actually running the plays. We're not on the field, right? But do we still have tremendous influences? Sometimes you use the puppet master, like who's pulling the strings behind the scenes, right? And I don't want to make it sound too Machiavellian, but there are aspects of ultimately that buyer is the one that's going to have to, drive the conversation. Again, if you have a mobilizer that's leading the effort within the buying group, right? In order to position them for success, often we on the sales side are having to coach and guide them to do the right right things, to say the right things, to get the right pieces in place, but also to know where things could go wrong. And so again, like any good coach, using the sports metaphor, you want to prepare them for success, but some of that is them being confident that they're aware of what can go wrong. And that's the big and hard mental shift for so many, not just individual sellers, but sales managers. When we've had these conversations with leaders, they're already like, wait, you want my people to go out there and tell them how this goes wrong? Again, that's a kind of hard for people to initially get their head around.
Well, what we're doing is we're doing exposure management. We're helping them
Exactly.
to understand that the decisions that they make can be reversed.
Yep.
That's one of the things that I see ego getting in the way. And we've made a decision, we're going to see it through. Well, again, if the context changes and you aren't ready to reverse it, then you're essentially shooting yourself in the foot. If you don't create exit possibilities, if you don't make it reversible, then chances are people will see that as an existential threat. And we need to make clear and be transparent about what can go wrong so that they can make an informed decision. Because I think the lie of omission is one of the things that we see a lot of sellers being very guilty of.
Yeah. And that's what customers fear, is what they're missing, right? And again, it's you emphasize the risk of the unknown. And we can often, like, you're talking about the neuroscience behind all this. And the neuroscience is fascinating because what we can imagine is so much more scary than the reality, right? It's why I've long been into film, and I don't know how much I don't know when last time you might have, or if you've ever seen a movie like Jaws, as sort of an all-time classic that did such a great job of
Sick.
building. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to a very dated example just because I saw an interview with Spielberg not that long ago, reflecting on it as it was the 50th anniversary, I think, of it originally releasing. But anyway, he talks about part of why they ended up not showing the shark was for technical reasons. But if you look at it through a neuroscience lens, what we can imagine is often so much more terrifying than what we actually see, right? And so that's where so much of the great horror over the years has been, where we didn't see the monster. We didn't see the thing we fear, because what we can create, and then often those movies will fail when they finally, the big reveal, oh, that looks like it's been CGI'd or green screened or whatever. It just is never as terrifying as what we can make up on our own. And again, that's part of the opportunity we're talking about here, is if we can say, no, you think there's an infinite number of potential risks, but there's really three that matter, because we've talked to customers who've been in your shoes, and the three things they tell you if they were on this call are, these are the things that really matter, and this is the one that you especially, that I wish I had paid attention to. And when you can bound that concern into a more narrow and manageable set of things that we can then help the customer overcome, then so much of the psychology you're talking about, we can help diffuse.
Well, I think one of the things that I really like about the frame making sale is that it gives agency back to the buyer instead of
Yeah.
trying to control them. One thing I was taught when I was in recruitment in my much younger
Yeah.
days was that you had to have client control and candidate control. No
Yeah.
buyer wants to be controlled.
Yep.
None of them want to be closed, handled, lied to, pressured, misled,
Yeah.
deceived, or some material fact omitted, so that they
Yeah.
then end up with egg on their face. Why it is that this still persists is beyond me, because if you're a buyer, and everyone is a buyer at some stage, when they receive that type of behavior from a salesperson, they inevitably clam up, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So what on earth are they thinking?
Yeah, it's fascinating. When we first, the very first research I did, as we began to, as the shape of the book came together, and again, the data point I shared earlier about the decision confidence was literally 10x in terms of its impact on these high quality low regret deals. Yeah, I just went and looked at the latest neuroscience on what are the drivers of decision confidence, not just for buyers but for humans across all aspects of our life. And Daniel Kahneman's last book, unfortunately, he passed away last year, but his last book was incredibly useful in this context. It's called Noise, and his stuff is always hard to read. He's not a great writer, but his ideas are so powerful. I would absolutely recommend that to folks who might be interested. But there ends up being kind of four primary drivers of decision confidence, two of which in the sales environment we really can't do anything about. But the other two are so absolutely critical. And the one that we're all aware of, we all know, a decision that feels easier to us, we're going to have more confidence in our ability to make it. Right. And again, we all talk about how do we make buying easier, right? Unfortunately, we all often talk about in the context, how do we make buying easier for them to buy our solution, not what is it going to make it easier for that customer to buy full stop and navigate their own internal organization, all the hurdles that you've already referenced. But that's the one kind of the world is already got some awareness of. But it's that second one around agency that it really felt like we were all missing. It just didn't hear that ever coming up. And whether you describe it as agency, which can be a little bit of a wonky term, what we're talking about really is a feeling of control, right? Do I have a sense that I can do what it's needed in order to make this thing happen, in order to make this decision? And whether you call it agency or autonomy, whatever term works best for you, that's a piece that so often, not only were we not really actively thinking about in sales, we were honestly doing things that were fundamentally undermining how much a feeling of control that person had, which one was undermining the decision confidence and then having adverse effects for deals ending up in no decision. So yeah, I think of the big ideas in the book that really hadn't gotten a lot of attention before we wrote it, I think you're absolutely right to highlight agency as one of the ones that we're hearing more and more from everyone we talk to.
I know that you guys have done a lot of work with Bob Moesta and looking at jobs to be done, the buyer's
Yeah,
journey, the four forces at work. And again, for people who are not familiar with the four forces, you've got the push, the pull, inertia, and anxiety. So push is the pain, trouble, trouble today, the catalyst for change.
yeah,
Pull is the desired better future. Inertia is the gravitational pull of do nothing. And
yeah,
anxiety is their fear of what happens after the sale. And I
yeah,
think what seems to be missing is enough time and effort thinking about how we land when we turn up in front of the customer and what's going through their mind. And people are trying to put them through a linear gated system, whereas
yeah,
in fact, what we know from the buyer's journey, I mean, in your book, you've got the spaghetti buyer's journey.
yeah,
And there are dozens and dozens of moments that occur with dozens and dozens of people. And all of those people are coming at it with their history, with their hopes, their fears. If we are not smart enough to put the time in and think about, okay, what's the outcome that they want?
yeah,
What does good look like to them? For that to be possible, what needs to happen before that, before that, before that? Then the odds are we're going to find ourselves just pushing into empty space and going off a cliff. So
yeah,
again, if we're thinking about decision survivability, that
yeah.
seems to be a really critical component. How do we create the conditions where each individual buyer feels like they can justify and defend the decision that they've made and survive it, even if it backfires and goes wrong?
Yeah, there's kind of I'm going to unpack that because there's what you've touched on are actually three of the four primary challenges to decision confidence that we found as part of this research, and then so much of what we have specifically in chapters 3 through 6 are then the solutions to help customers overcome those. Well, let me go ahead and just name them in terms of specifically what we're getting after here, because the first of those is decision complexity. That's the spaghetti bowl dynamic that's trying to navigate all the consensus within the broad buying group and all the diversity that appears there, and how you actually even just line up what are those, again, those buying journeys that people are going to be progressing at different speeds. And I often use the analogy of chutes and ladders, the kids game of hey, it feels like every step we take forward we hit something and go back to the beginning. It's sort of like go to jail, don't go back to don't pass go, don't get your
Yeah.
$200. So that's certainly a critical aspect of it. But you touched on two of the others that are equally important that I don't want us to lose sight of, because what ends up being what we focus on in chapter 5 is this idea of objective misalignment. And that's that aspect of, yep, your primary buyer, maybe the primary user or beneficiary of whatever solution is being acquired. But what they care about and what the head of marketing or the head of finance or the head of IT care about just will be very different. I mean, just even the outcomes they're trying to achieve, just maybe measured so differently. And that question of what does winning look like? What does success look like? What results are we ultimately trying to achieve can be such a source of challenge for a customer to navigate, again, without our help. And so that's one of these four huge challenges that we need to help them overcome in order to make sure their decision confidence is sufficient to actually get the purchase done. But then the fourth one you mentioned about the anxiety is the one that sometimes we overlook, which is that question of forecasting the future, right? And this, again, is something the neuroscience is very clear we're really bad at, right? Humans are terrible at discounting future value to the present, right? Again, if you think about our hunter-gatherer forefounders, hey, a bird in the hand is worth an infinite number of birds in the bush in the future, right? Because if we don't survive today, it doesn't matter what tomorrow looks like, right? And so our ability to do that kind of discounting, our intuition for that math is absolutely horrible. And there's been so many behavioral economic studies that just reinforce just how badly we do that. So that whole question of that anxiety of whether we're going to realize the promised results, again, it's another aspect that we absolutely need to make sure we're helping our customers overcome, because much like that fear of the shark that we can't see, that fear of how sure your other customers may realize those returns. And I'm not saying I doubt your ROI calculator. What I'm saying is I doubt my organization's ability to successfully achieve those results, because we are, again, we all feel like we work for the most dysfunctional company in the world and some level we may be right, but that question of how we're uniquely going to screw up this thing and cause it to, fail in ways that I can't imagine right now, which not only hurts us collectively, but hurts me individually, is the third of kind of these four critical things that undermine decision confidence and cause these deals to go bad. So I absolutely agree. All three of those are absolutely critical. And literally we wrote entire chapters to help not only diagnose what's going on in each, but what we as sellers can do to help customers overcome them. I'm happy to unpack any of them, but they're just such big topics to get after. Wanted to make sure I chalked the field before we dove too deep into any of them.
Well, I think we need to look through the eyes of the customer and we need to meet them where they are.
Yep.
However, often they don't really understand where they are either. So
Yep.
how do we help them get that understanding? Because it's all well and good, say, meet the customer where they are. But if they're in a state of confusion or misconception, then it doesn't matter what you think. You have to take a few steps back and guide them. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah. And a lot of that, we talk a lot about the importance of empathy throughout all of this, that aspect of really trying to appreciate what a customer is facing. And you emphasized, those all those fears, the classic, push-pull inertia, anxiety, all the things that come along with every aspect of this. But that's where, again, we have this asymmetry of information advantage because of our opportunity to work with many, many buyers like them. And so that aspect of us having a role, not as much as being the experts, but being the connector to information and even more so stories of, hey, this is what we've seen or what has been shared with us by other customers like you, is really what is necessary or what might be something you'd be concerned about. So would it be helpful for me to connect you to them, or me to kind of be the virtual individual to share and synthesize what we're hearing from people like you? And it's that aspect of, again, being on the same side of the fence, again, emphasizing this element of empathy. So we really are helping helping that customer make the best decision they can in as little time as possible. And that's the piece that it is a big mindset shift, and it's literally what we call it in the book. It's the Framemaking Mindset, is specifically that. But it's that posture that again, we've heard from the most progressive heads of sales we've worked with that have really embraced it and seen the results from this. Because once we are taking that posture with customers, so much of what you're talking about in terms of that classic antagonism or conflict, that we're the seller, that we're trying to force them or push them or pressure them in ways, it's breaking from that entire legacy dynamic to one where no, we're helping you make the best decision you can, and I'm here to help you do that, and I'm helping you do it as quickly as you can, because if your best decision is to stick with the status quo or buy for someone else, that's in my best interest as well, because then I know, hey, we shouldn't be wasting each other's time on this one. At some point, if you get A, B, or C in place and it makes sense for us to chat, well, then I hope I'm the first person you call. But for now, let's make sure we're disqualifying together whether this is something that's a good fit for you. And again, that's a very different way to think about those early sales conversations, but something that we're seeing just have such powerful results.
I think four questions really summarize trying to work out what they're trying to do, which is what are they actually trying to do? Why now? Why in
Yep.
this way? And why this option versus any other option? And I think unless we can help them work out where the tension is, what's feasible, what's going to catalyze or activate the decision, and what their options are, then we're jumping ahead of we're putting the cart before the horse. And
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and sorry to interrupt, but that's circling back to the work that Bob did with some of my CP peers back in the day. That's where even that spaghetti bowl graphic you mentioned, the four core jobs we talk about that's the foundation, that spaghetti bowl, is identifying the problem. What is the thing we're trying to solve for? Right, that solution exploration. What's the solution for it? What are the requirements for that solution? Again, and then finally supplier selection. And again, if we think about it from those 4 jobs, which roughly line up to those 4 questions that you just highlighted, again, that's what a customer ultimately needs to make sure they're solving for. And if they're not able to do that, then the deal is just not going to happen. And so much of our role has to be helping them with that first question you highlighted. What are they actually trying to do? And what is good? What does a win look like for them and their organization? And that's where so often we fly past that without really getting it nailed.
And that then speaks to the syntax, because I think many salespeople start with their creds. They're trying
Yeah,
to convince you that we are the best supplier to select. And that
yeah,
is the least important of the 4 parts of the buyer's journey.
yeah, yeah. That's all about us having us helping the customer have confidence in us, to trust us as the supplier. And again, certainly I totally appreciate why that's been part of so many playbooks for so many years, but that kind of misses the point at some level, that it's not about that customer having the supply, the trust in the supplier. It's having that confidence in themselves, right? And so much of we emphasize here is this supplier agnostic need that we just, and you talk to even very progressive, very senior commercial leaders, when you talk about, hey, there's such emphasis, so many people talk about being more customer centric. This is the year we're really going to focus on the customer. I don't know how many sales kickoffs I've been to where that was the core talking point.
That's like
But
saying I'm going to get fit this year.
exactly, right. But when you then look at what we actually say, it's not about the customer. It's about us. It's about how great our solutions are. It's how trustworthy we are. What a great partner we are. How we've been around for 150 years. Like all these things that are all about us. And that's where if you really take a hard look at how much of the time and energy we're devoting to change a customer's perspective about us or about themselves, that mix. And again, we still need to, of course, demonstrate the power and successfulness of our solutions, but that's insufficient if we're not building that confidence in their own ability to make a decision and deliver on what they're trying to achieve.
Well, this then, you can't get away from um, the money behind a business permeates the culture beneath it. And
Absolutely.
too often, the fixation on the exit, the enterprise value, the alpha
Yep.
is distracting. And what that does is it creates an environment where sellers are fixated on the transaction. They're not focused on creating customers for life. And
Yeah.
the net result of that is that you create massively inefficient, extremely expensive, and highly unsuccessful go-to-market teams. So,
Yeah.
what would you say to founders and investors and boards, so that maybe we wake them up and have them open their eyes and start thinking differently, so that they actually create real enterprise value and they create the multipliers?
Yeah. It really comes down to the hard question that when we have these types of frame making conversations with CEOs and their directs, the thing that we push, we reference it as a negative brainstorm. And these are ideas that are more in the workshop than in the book. But it's say, all right, what's the example of the customer that actually is not a good fit for your solution, right? Please describe the persona or whatever the dimensions are of someone that you would honestly say, yep, they are not ready to buy what we have. And when you ask that of a CEO and their directs, then there's an immediately sort of a defensive response like, well, we don't want to think that way, right? And what I challenge you is, well, wait a second. How can you honestly disqualify leads if you're not willing to think that way? Right. If you're not willing to really challenge yourself to say, hey, who actually, like, I use UPS and FedEx as sort of the classic historical example. Like, back in the day, if you were FedEx, who should buy from UPS? Right now, over the years, FedEx and UPS have so worked to essentially have every offering the other one has, that these days it's probably less easy to answer that question in a true duopoly market like that. But historically, UPS and FedEx would both have been able to say, you know what, if you want to do something that's more bespoke, more we're going to get it to you by plane, next day, like all those next day air things that FedEx used to be differentiated on versus UPS, more scale and efficiency for the bulk type stuff. There was a clear, hey, no, if you're this type of customer, back then each of them would say, you know what, actually you're probably better suited for the other guy. Nowadays, as all of our solutions have become so much more expansive and there's so much less competitive differentiation, especially for these big solution offerings, then it's harder, I appreciate, for a CEO and their directs to say, know what, yes, we're going to carve out our space as this, and we're going to say if a customer really lacks A, B, or C, they're not a good fit. And I'm not talking about the classic BANT style metrics of do they not have budget or authority and need time. It's specifically a customer that has the budget, that has the authority, that has a need and has the urgency for the timing, but still they don't quite have this piece that we know from other customers we worked with historically that have bought our solution and had suboptimal results because they were missing A, B, or C capability within the organization, or whatever it might be. If you're not willing to take that hard look in the mirror and say, you know what, these are things that truly should disqualify someone from being a buyer from us yet, that we may be able to guide them to put those pieces in place, right? We may have some technology solution that requires having, an AI console set up or whatever it might be that this organization might not have that level of maturity yet to have that there. Then for us to give the guidance to our customers, say, you know what, here's something that we find our buyers really are only successful when they have this in place first. If you don't have that, we're happy to give you some guidance as what that might look like. So you can go ahead and get that and put in place. And then we're happy to have the conversation with you then in terms of what next steps might look like. But if we're not willing to take that step as to what truly is disqualifying a buyer using this negative brainstorm, then how can we hope that our line seller is going to be able to do that and help customers not bring in those bad accounts, those deals that we struggle to serve and become the source of our churn? If we can't do that, how can the sellers hope to succeed?
Well, that also needs to involve marketing, because marketing brings in the top of the funnel leads, and they should be massively disqualifying. I mean, one of the things I always teach my clients is you start with your anti-ICP, and you clear all of those out. So let's get practical. If I'm a traditional seller, but I've read the book, what can I do on a Tuesday to start behaving in a more frame-making way?
Yeah, the first thing, and this I'll just reiterate what I mentioned earlier about that mindset piece, because at the core of that mindset is helping that customer make the best decision they can in as little time as possible. And so much of that, in terms of what that customer needs in order to make that best decision, what they're looking for is the experience of other people like them. And so the first thing we teach in all our workshops is something we call the phrase that frames. And actually, if you have the first edition of the book, it actually has a different name. We renamed it based on our workshop experience after the book came out. So if anyone gets the second edition, we'll have the updated language. But this phrase that frames is taking a posture of working with other customers like you. It's shifting the source of authority, not from my expertise, not from my knowledge, not from what I've been doing for the last decades of selling. It's my source of authority is connecting you as a buyer to other people like you who have faced a similar challenge, that I can be a connector, not an expert. And as a connector, I'll help you see what they've experienced and help you avoid those potholes that you might have tripped on otherwise. Not based on my knowledge, not based on my brilliance, not based on my expertise, but based on my ability to connect with other people who face this exact same challenge.
Well, I think you've probably answered some of it, but if I were turning up as a traditional seller, I'd be pitching. So what does the frame-making discovery call sound like at the actual moment where I would normally pitch?
Yeah, so I think if you think about that, those first aspects of the pitch, especially if you're anyone familiar with the classic sort of challenger 6-step choreography, then there's the little warmer, the reframe, et cetera, right? The thing and again, all that fits within the frame making construct, but with a little bit of a twist. But the twist now is in what we need going into those calls, or if it's the first discovery, what we need to be bringing out of it is, what is that core challenge? What's the source of complexity? What's the thing that's going to overwhelm this customer as they try and make this decision? What's that first thing that they're going to need to overcome, right? And some of those may be very simple questions that there's just a facts kind of answer to, but any places where it's a question of complexity and they're overwhelmed by potential information and not knowing where to even get started, that's the fourth of the challenges that we haven't talked about yet, which is to help them bound that search for information, for them to bound what it is they need to explore to the things that matter most. So where I would start that type of conversation, where I'd advise a seller to also start, is trying to help the customer explore where their biggest sources of anxiety are around just making a decision. What information do they feel like they're missing? Where do they feel like they're getting stuck? And then have that be the point that we can then intervene with that phrase that frames, that helps them say, you know what? Other customers in that situation might have thought they needed to boil the ocean and look at 100 different sources. It turns out that we found, and again, checklists are so powerful for this as a framing device, that there's these 3 or 4 things that that most customers have found most useful. Have you seen these? And sometimes those 3 or 4 won't even be something from my organization. And one of the best practices we've seen related to this was actually, someone pointing to, you know what, that, the Amazon or the IBM back in the day, they have this really great asset that you've probably already seen. If you haven't, you should take a look at it. But that's where we as a seller have opportunity to not only point to that agnostically of who wrote it, but to then plant the seed of, hey, as you're thinking about this, keep this in the back of your mind, because that's the thing that Amazon or IBM or Microsoft didn't tell you, right? And so it's that aspect of framing the information search, framing the way they discover the information around that question they're trying to get answered. That's where we have the role, not just to unearth, hey, here's the need, but here's how they're going to go about answering that need. Here's how they're going to do their investigation exploration, because that's where they're going to get stuck.
So that speaks to something in the book, which is that you don't necessarily create more content, but you help
Yes.
people make sense of what's already out there.
Absolutely. And that's where frame-making, the two active ingredients of frame-making are prompting, which is the, hey, what have they missed? What have they not found on their own? The classic reframe in the challenger space. So much of what we've done has been prompting the customer with new information. But in a world of information overload, where we're all prone to be maximizers and all the challenges that come with that, then that's where, more important than ever, is this idea of how we can help bound their search for information, bound the decisions in a way. And that's why the book is called Frame-making. It's putting a frame around things so we can help a customer appreciate, here's what matters, but here's what matters less. And these are the things that really are most important to focus on.
I was going to ask what should managers do stop doing, but I'm going to move it slightly further, which is what should they do differently in deal reviews, QBRs, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's the, so often, and I appreciate there's a will skill dynamic always at work in any of these conversations, right? And any of the teams I've managed, and it's so common for anyone in management, whether it's in sales or any other field, that to make sure people are feeling sufficient motivation, enthusiasm, et cetera. And so often there's the tendency to encourage that seller to, hey, keep beating your head against the wall until you either break through or are concussed, right? There's kind of that element of dynamic that so often ends up being a huge part of it. And that's the piece that we're really trying to encourage the dialing back from. Right. Not that people don't need to be motivated, but if there is that customer or deal that really is stuck, they may be stuck for reasons that are very, again, psychologically driven in terms of them as an individual. That if we aren't properly diagnosing the nature of their neuroscience, their psychology, then to keep piling on with, well, wait a second, maybe we need to do another demo, or maybe we need to, clearly they're not bought in, so we need to go through the ROI calculator for the third time, right? So often we're piling on with what the customer knows, but failing to really get after what the customer feels, right? And when we present this idea, especially to line managers, that aspect of, holy cow, that sounds hard, like human psychology and feeling, that's such a Pandora's box. But that's where we're so lucky with the research coming back to say, no, we don't have to address the entire range and the vast diversity of human needs and human psychology. There's one feeling that we're working towards, because we know the data shows unequivocally that the thing that matters is their confidence and their ability to make a decision. So all the other feelings, fear, uncertainty, everything else that has been historically part of the bundle that we've thought about, no, the one thing we need to have that seller help that customer with is increasing their confidence. And if we are seeing a customer that fundamentally is not confident, and we aren't able to determine the nature of what's causing that loss of confidence, I don't think there's ever been a better way to disqualify a deal, even when you had all the BANT criteria checked, right? If there isn't that core confidence and we don't understand what are the things that are blocking that confidence, then the rest of the deal review is honestly probably a waste of everybody's time.
So this then makes me think about win-loss reviews, post-mortems.
Yep.
I'm a big fan of the pre-mortem,
Yep.
and I think almost nobody seems to do them.
Yep.
Which is a massive oversight, because I think what we can do is eliminate a lot of the projected perceived risk. And
Yep.
what we know from the research that Dr. Darrell Stickle did is that uncertainty and vulnerability lead to perceived risk. So what we need to be doing is spending more time in planning, in preparation, in pre-morteming, in doing these negative workshops, in order to mitigate the effect of what's going on in the buyer's brain. Just denying it is
Absolutely.
stupid.
Absolutely. And that's where, when we set up the steps of frame making, so it's 3 E's, establish, engage and execute. And that established step of how do you establish the framing that the customer is going to benefit from to overcome whatever the challenges they're facing, whatever we need to do to take that complexity and make it manageable so the customer can progress on their journey. That established, again, in our workshops and everything we do, the vast majority of the time is devoted to that element to get that prep right. I couldn't agree more that, that time spent in preparation for the conversation to really understand, all right, where, again, hypothesize, even if it's a FSI, what are we anticipating based on working with other customers like this person I'm about to talk to? Where are they likely to struggle, right? Where can we hypothesize? And again, this is so much of this empathy dynamic we're talking about, because we can not only hypothesize the challenge, but we can hypothesize their emotional response to that challenge. And as we think about those are the things we want to be prepared for, to again, put out there and say, hey, working with other customers like you, we often hear X, Y, or Z are hard, and they can feel frustrating or whatever the emotional language that corresponds with that. And to put both of those on the table gives license for the conversation to go in that direction, right? And again, we're not talking about our solution, we're talking about them and their needs and how we help them, right? And if we start the conversation and initiate the relationship on that basis, then again, we're on the same side of the fence. We're working together to figure out, hey, is this a good fit or not? And if it's not, great, let's figure this out right away, because I'll talk to the next customer, right? I'll use my time more efficiently, and so will you. And so that's where it really does become that win-win that we all often reference, but so often don't actually achieve.
Sadly, we're coming to time. What's the one question I should have asked that I haven't?
Yeah, the thing, you've gotten to a lot of those core questions around, hey, what do I do first, right? And that's where so much of what we talked about has been kind of conceptual and not so practical. And so the thing that I would put on the table we haven't talked about yet is what we call the it turns out that audits, right? And again, it gets into that question of how other customers have struggled. And this is where, again, the wording from that comes from those, what we joke about in the book as the 4 worst words to hear in sales, right? We've got the deal, you've got to forecast 90%, close this month, going to get me in President's Club, going to send me to the Bahamas, and then, customer black hole, suddenly you're not hearing anything. They finally get them on the phone and they start off with it turns out that, and whatever follows those 4 words are why this deal ain't happening and why you shouldn't be packing your swimsuit, right? And so what we encourage organizations and individual sellers to do is to take that hard look in the mirror of the it turns out that audit, again, from a classic win-loss, no decision perspective, say, hey, what are those things? What's the 80-20 rule of the things that are really causing customers to get stuck? What are they finding hard? And run right after those, right? So often there's a tendency for us, I know I've done this myself in sales, where like, hey, I kind of know this customer hasn't asked this hard question yet, and I'm kind of hoping they don't so I can get it signed and closed without having to really deal with that. Whenever you catch yourself feeling that, that's exactly the thing you really need to kind of run after, because otherwise it comes up in that it turns out that nasty surprise at the end of the day, right? Not that you might not be able to fix it then, but had you proactively gotten after it up front, and this is the homework that not only sellers can do individually, but our commercial leaders really need to think about, because that's where the scale comes in. That's where we have the advantage of all the customers we work with. Say, you know what? Here's the 3 or 4 real failure points where customers getting stalled and stuck and deals are being lost or wasting a huge amount of our time and our customers' time. It's really taking that hard look in the mirror to get after doing that. It turns out that audit. That's the thing I'd encourage everyone who's in a commercial leadership role to be thinking about, because our sellers can't be successful. We're not arming them with the right information, and that's the raw material for that information.
So if you're a seller, you've read the Framemaking Sale, and you're trying to take this to your senior management, how would you recommend that they do this, especially if they're in a quarter-driven, high-pressure, PE-backed business? Because there must be a lot of pushback.
No, what I would start with is the very practical, tactical. Here's the deal I'm working right now. Here's where the customer's stuck, not just from what they need to know, but in terms of things that are undermining their confidence to make a decision. Where have we helped other customers? Because again, we've got a lot of, assuming it's not a brand new startup that's selling something for the very first time, we will most likely have a collection of happy customers that have succeeded in overcoming this particular challenge, right? But me as an individual seller may not have access to all of those. And so it's bringing that, hey, this is what's undermining my customer's confidence. This is where they're struggling. This is where they're stuck in a cycle of analysis paralysis, or getting alignment about objectives across, all the different CXOs that need to be part of this deal, or whomever the buying group might look like. This is where I need the help for you to give me the framing, the tools to help this customer overcome this. So this is exactly what I need to help this customer buy better. Right. And so me as an individual seller will know that from a concrete example of a customer I'm working with, and to put it on my leadership, my sales ops, rev ops manager, marketing, et cetera, to then get me that framing to help that customer overcome that challenge. And that's the thing as individual sellers, rather than kind of buying into the entire concept, it's very practical. This is what I need to help this customer buy better.
What's interesting is I had a SaaS scale up and a multi-billion manufacturing client last year. And in both cases, neither of them had that continuity or those connections. They were completely siloed, and
Yep.
all those stories existed in isolation. And when the salespeople tried to get hold of them, they were constantly rebutted and pushed back. So again, this seems to be something that leadership needs to take by the horns. What would you say if an organization is fractured like that?
Yeah, and some of the clients we're working with very much suffer from that problem, right? And so that's where so much of what we're doing, like the workshops we're running now, we are really pushing our clients to include not just the sellers, but the line managers, the subject matter experts, those other people that are either in that immediate management chain, but anyone who's customer facing to make sure they're participating collectively. Because in order to really get after something like that, it turns out that audit that I was mentioning, you need that broad range of perspective, not just for an individual deal, but across many deals. And so it really is team sport. There's again, we've paid lip service, often in the space, this has been talked about, in various ways. But here, what we're talking about really truly has to be team sport, where yes, the rep may be the person who's actually out there engaging the customer as part of that second E of frame making. But in terms of all that prep work to establish what's needed to help that customer, that's where the broader group needs to be involved. And for organizations that have the classic empire built silos, again, it's the classic building the agile, often they would be described as SWAT team, or whatever language you want to give to that cross-functional group that needs to come together in order to figure out, hey, where's the customer really struggling? Where are deals getting stuck? Why are we losing? Because customers are failing to be able to make a decision with confidence. And then pulling together the resources across those areas to get after it, it's got to be cross-functional. And if it's not, then I don't know if I can honestly help them, Marcus. I hate to
Well,
say that, but
I think many
without
of them,
that, I don't know if it's doable.
I think many of them are beyond help because they pay lip service to being customer centric, but they're not. They're investor centric. Finance seems to have a stranglehold,
Yeah,
and the silos and the empire building and the ego is getting in the way. Um,
yeah.
it's
And let,
heartbreaking.
yeah, let me tell you a story. Again, we do it, we tell it in the book, but I'll try and recap it shortly here, knowing we're running short on time. But it's what we call the parking garage story. And it's an example of someone in the medical device space, a seller there who's working a decent sized deal with a hospital group. And so the key decision maker is the chief of surgery. And so they've been working with them for quite a few months about a new piece of equipment that's going to come in that is going to not only save lives, because it's going to allow this hospital to do additional diagnostics they couldn't before, but also it's going to be a significant source of revenue because normally they would have to send people to other facilities. And so it's truly, it's going to be a win in terms of patient outcomes. It's going to be a win in terms of financial results. And the seller's done everything right. They've got their chief of surgery, their main point of contact, their champion or mobilizer, already. But the final conversation is it has to go in front of one of these capital review boards, right? And so the seller can't be present for that. But they're like, hey, we've done everything. We've got the chief of surgery is prepped. They've got all the assets. They've got all the data. They're ready to go. And so the seller's sitting by their phone waiting for how it went. And the clock's ticking, hours pass, and they're getting nervous. And then finally, the chief of surgery calls and say, "Yeah, I'm sorry, it didn't go our way." And he's like, "What do you mean? You're bought in. You see the value and everything else." It's like, and here we get the dreaded. It turns out that, and in this case, that it turns out that was the CMO said, "You know what? Totally appreciate everything you're saying, but we have this other problem. And this other problem is we're hearing so much that our patients are really frustrated because of the parking situation at our facility, where they're dropping off a loved one at urgent care and they're then having to circle for 30 minutes to try and find parking somewhere. So they're literally driving, even in a life-threatening emergent situation, they're driving 10 or 15 minutes further before they can get help because of what our reputation is around parking. And so our challenge here is to decide whether we want to use the capital we would spend on this important life-saving piece of equipment or devote it to building a parking garage." So the punchline of the story is, yep, I was the number one solution to what proved to be the number two problem, and the deal got lost to a parking garage. Right now, again, that particular story has a very unfortunate ending because they ended up not doing the deal. And so I've been tested by heads of commercial leaders. It's like, well, Karl, what would you have done differently in that situation? If a deal's being lost to a parking garage, how are you going to overcome that? And that's the core to what we talk about in chapter 5 and that question of objective alignments, because we clearly here have an objective misalignment, right? Where the CMO is after something completely different from the chief of surgery. But what the commonality is that I think was lost in the moment was to think about it from, again, a capital allocation dynamic perspective, right? And taking advantage of the time horizon that both of these opportunities could be achieved by. And if I was that seller in the moment and had seen something like this before, I'd push, say, well, have they thought about how quickly we can get this new equipment up and have it start generating revenue? And that revenue could then be part of what funds the parking garage. So you don't have a fixed pie of capital expenditure as you're thinking about it now. And this is where the kind of the classic challenger reframe plays in. You could have thought about it in terms of a time value of money conversation, right? But that actually didn't play out. But that's how I would think about it differently. Again, if you can anticipate and apply the types of techniques that we're teaching in frame making.
Well, one of the things that I've learned over the last decade or so is that the ability to join the dots between the components is a function of leadership. And that is where I think our next generation of leaders is going to come from, through sales, because the ones that can join the dots inevitably behave as leaders. And our customers are looking for leadership. Leadership doesn't mean that you're creating followers. You're creating more leaders. You're helping them to make better decisions well and de-risking them so that they can live with the consequences and be able to defend them, not only if it goes wrong, but also during the buying process as they take it into the second and third room. So I think that's a really great place to finish, because if we understand that your internal champion or mobilizer has to take it into the corridors where it can die, into the second room, and if it can't travel unedited, and for them to be able to explain it clearly in the same words that you did, then the odds are it's going to be translated, and Chinese whispers kicks in, and before you know it, when it goes into the allocation committee, they don't really see the value of it, and they don't see it as part of that bigger solution because they're not looking at a joined up business. They're looking at pockets.
Exactly. And that's, you've made such a compelling case, and probably better than I ever have, in terms of why execute, which is the third E of frame making, is so absolutely crucial, and the thing that often is also undergunned, because exactly the reasons of like how we enable that mobilizer, that champion, to then be the person that is helping to herd the cats and make the deal happen. That's a piece that is absolutely critical and often under we just don't invest the time. It's the first, and like we all focus on the actual conversation, the engage piece, which absolutely is important, and that's why where we start so often is helping sellers learn how to utilize the phrase, the frames. But what has to go around it in terms of the establish and the execute, without those, we have the best sellers doing the best engagement in the world, and things can still go off the rails.
Carl, thank you so much for this. This has been massively insightful. I'd love to do it again if you're up for it.
I really enjoyed the conversation, Marcus. Yeah, let me know.
Fabulous. Thank you. How can people get hold of you?
Yeah, so the best way to reach us is that the book is entitled The Framemaking Sale. And so for more information related to it, you can go to theframemakingsale.com. That's probably the best place to get information, both to get more information about the book, and if you'd like to order a copy, that can be, well, it's available at all your favorite booksellers. I'm not allowed to mention one specific bookseller, or my publisher will slap my hands again. So whatever your preferred bookseller is, it's available there, and it's in an audio version now as well. But if you're interested in some of these other aspects of how we're helping teams work with both adopting the ideas, getting the sense of how this all works for their organization, whether it's a keynote at sales kickoff or these types of workshops that I mentioned throughout the call, more details on all that is available at theframemakingsale.com.
So final question then. You've got a golden ticket and you can go and whisper in the ear of the idiot Carl at age 23. What one bit of salient advice would you give him?
So much of what I felt that was sort of the dirty baggage of sales. Again, because I had such a perception in my early consulting career that I wanted to solve the problems and work with the customers and not sell the consulting engagements. And very quickly, my partners realized, well, Carl, you're very effective in the selling. I just wish you had some gray hairs to make you more credible as an authority on this stuff. I moved out of consulting in many ways because of a core aversion to being the seller, not the builder. And what I'm appreciating now is, it took me years to come to appreciate, well, if you can't help the customer appreciate the potential of what you can help them achieve, then nothing else matters, right? So you may have the best mousetrap in the world, but if the world doesn't know they can benefit from it, then you're really not going to be able to make a difference in anyone's lives. So what I would have taught my 23-year-old is, hey, embrace the critical role of sales and marketing much early.
Excellent. Karl Schmidt, thank you.
No, I really appreciate it, Marcus.